Welcome to the Cowboy Office Show, where you'll experience expert analysis and epic discussion on key pillars of the equine industry, including sports, business, hobby, and the horse lifestyle. Your co-hosts are Jody Brainerd and Brian Dykert, industry veterans with over 120 years combined living the cowboy lifestyle. The Cowboy Office Show will help you get involved, ask more questions, and create change. We'll keep riding for you as together we learn from the ride already ridden, learn to listen better to our horse, and make our industry better for all. Each weekly episode will take a ride around the industry in less time than you can load the truck and trailer. Drop your email at cowboyoffice.com to receive weekly updates and never miss an episode. Saddle up as we ride into today's show.
Well, welcome to the Cowboy Office again. I'm Brian, and we have Miss Chelsea Sutton as our professional moderator to help us with this week's episode.
Hey, and I'm Jody, and I'm way happy to be here. We have a great show. Today we're going to discuss why our circles and rollback maneuvers are so varied from the judge's standpoint. It's the biggest maneuver evaluation point differentials on any of our maneuvers. So that's our topic for today.
I am honored to be with you, Chelsea Sutton here. Thank you guys for having me again. I enjoy these conversations so much because they bring so much insight and shed so much light on the complexities of reining and why we enjoy this sport so much. And I'd love to dive into the data and have you guys talk us through. We've got some more graphs, and I appreciate the information you guys are going to bring us. We're going to utilize the 2022 National Reining Horse Association Futurity to look at some of the maneuver score spreads and particularly highlight circles and rollbacks, stops and rollbacks, to better understand the judging and the judging complexities that come in those. Let's take a look at the graph that shows the maneuver spreads by maneuver. So showing that where the maneuver spreads happen in the rollback, circles, and spins.
Mm-hmm. And we're using the futurity for the obvious reason because it's the most closest to everybody's kind of mind. So I think a large portion of the audience was paying attention. And so we have data across the year of our H events, but we're just looking at the open futurity. And what this graph looks at is the semifinals and the finals as per maneuver group, and it's looking at maneuvers that had a deviation, a spread of 1 point or more across 5 judges, across every maneuver, across all the runs. So that's what this data is looking at, semifinals and finals. And so all it shows us is the total amount of runs. So in the semifinals, you had 177 runs, 2 sections, 4 levels. The red column shows you the number of runs. Out of 177 runs, we had 23 runs that had maneuver spreads of 1 point or more. Of those 23 runs, you had 13 runs in the semifinals of rollbacks and stop maneuvers. So 13 runs had a deviation of 1 point or more in maneuver evaluations in the stops and rollbacks. You had 8 runs in the semifinals that had maneuver evaluation deviation of 1 point or more. You had 8 runs that had it in the circles, and then you had 4 runs that had it in the spins. And then the same is true when you go through the finals, because in the finals we had 96 runs, again, 2 sections, 4 levels. You had 34 runs. So statistically, percentage-wise, it goes up. You had more runs, had more spreads as the depth of competition went up. 96 runs, 34 runs have a deviation of a point or more. 21 runs had them in the stops and rollbacks. And 10 runs had them in the circles, and 4 runs had them in the spins.
And for clarification, this does not take into account a penalty that would have existed on that. So this is just looking at those maneuver scores.
Correct. This is completely independent of penalty application.
Great.
This is just the decision. This is the basis of our sport, which it's a control game, and this is the decisions by experts, the officials, on how good a maneuver is displayed as the industry defines it.
Jody, can you explain? It's obvious that rollbacks and circles are the two biggest categories of where maneuver spreads exist. So can you explain, let's start with rollbacks, which I'm speaking of all encompassing. The maneuvers of stop and back, stop and rollback would all be encompassed into this. Can you explain with as much detail as possible?
And stop and hesitate. Keep going.
Yes, thank you. With as much detail as possible, as a judge, the factors that would go into a maneuver score evaluation in that stop and rollback maneuver.
Okay. Well, yeah, for sure. And I think, part of the reason that we see some differences of opinion in these maneuvers. First of all, I mean, from an educational standpoint, I mean, it's a big part of it. But you have so many components to these maneuvers that say maybe a spin does not have. So if we're talking about that stop and rollback or the stop and the backup. Like say you've heard me lobby a lot of times for the backup to be a separate maneuver because there's so much weight that can be put on that as opposed to the run in and the stop. But so if I'm a judge, I'm looking at maybe my horse coming out of lead change into circle. I have how is he steering? How is he listening to the rider as he makes the end around for his approach? And so does he allow the rider to set up? Is the rider doing the one that's doing the driving? In other words, is he telling the horse to run? Does the horse run like he's supposed to? Does the horse set up just a little teeny bit? Or does he carry it through to the stop? And then when he rolls back, does he roll back straight over his hock? Is it a very crisp rollback? Is he just do kind of like a slow motion half turn and then lope out? Does he swap ends? Does he maybe have a great stop and a crisp rollback and then maybe does a shuffle out of there? Maybe not enough for me to call it a trot, but is it a clean lope out? How much weight does a judge give to each one of those components? And when three of them are good and one of them are bad, what is he supposed to do? So it's he or she, excuse me. But that there are so many components to that, and like I said, the stop, the run in, the stop, the back up. Is that horse lifting a foot up? Does he not lift a foot up? There's just so many variances on those maneuvers. And from an educational standpoint, sometimes there's not enough, our maneuver evaluation standards sometimes don't cover enough of that. They don't cover enough of the components of this part is really, really good, and then this part is average, and this part is poor, and we've only got those half-point increments to work with, and they're hard to mark.
They sure are. There's a lot to it. There's a lot to it because if the horse and rider are moving, the officiating system's got to be moving with it, and there are a lot that go to it, and it's never the same. No two are ever the same. So even though we want it to be, it's not. So, wow, I would go. When Jody raises the question of, I think it's a phenomenal question, and should some of our maneuvers be broken into more maneuver groups? So I think it's a huge question and a great one. And let's spend some time picking those apart, because whether it's the stop and the back, can you break that up? Sure. The stop and the hesitate, can you break that up? Maybe not. It's all one. But the stop and the rollbacks, sure you could. The lead changes, we know that, they're supposed to be tied to the circles, but has a tendency to carry over into that next maneuver. And so should it or shouldn't? And maybe we should mark the lead changes only by itself, and that would make our accuracy in the circles go up, maybe. So the rollbacks, I can say, this is my view, as a sport, the most diverse style we see in the sport of reining today is in the rollbacks. And that is exhibitor responsibility because they get to display how they want it to be. You know, the officials are supposed to be evaluating how good it is or not. And it's the true rollback, which is a reversal of direction over the horse's haunch. I'm using simple words, but that's what it is. Now, go do that. Well, that's like a U-turn. A U-turn is different than a three-point turn. So,
Can I read what the rule book says about a rollback?
Sure.
Rollbacks are a 180-degree reversal of forward motion completed by running to a stop, rolling, or turning the shoulders back to the opposite direction over the hocks and departing in a lope as one continuous motion. The NRHA handbook states no hesitation. However, a slight pause to regain footing or balance should not be deemed hesitation. The horse should not step ahead or back up prior to rolling back.
Right, and there is that what you just read was the pursuit of the sport and the industry to more clearly define what a rollback is. I said it in 6 words, you said it in a paragraph. Okay, good for the sport for trying to be that clear on it. But using a little bit, a horse that is truly rolling over his haunch and rolls more than 180 degrees, most of the time won't stand up. I mean, it's physically almost impossible. So for a horse to overturn and do a lope departure, and I'm telling you the answer because I'm saying it in words, it's not a rollback in the first place because a turn and a lope departure is very different than a rollback. So, and we have fun beating these conversations up as judges, and so, but on the rollback, so I elaborated a little bit more on Jody's take, but it's very complex because there's a lot of parts in there.
When you said when the horse is moving, we have to be moving with it. Can you explain what you mean?
Well, that's, yes. There's 2 parts to that. 1 is a theory and 2 is my own practical. Because in my 35-year career, I taught myself things in the pursuit to be a better judge. And I wanted to be a better judge so that I could provide better service to the exhibitor because that's all I wanted. So what we've learned is we've learned a number of things, but to minimize the last effect of any given maneuver, your last impression, is generally more impactful than your first and your middle impressions. Those are all true. You know, your first impression when we meet is one thing. The longer I spend with you, that impression starts to change. Those are all true statements in how we function and analyze stuff. Same is true in the maneuver evaluation decision. So what we've known is that last impression will have a tendency to be more impactful. How do we minimize that and make it equal? The barometer and all of those complexities. And so one of the things that I learned how to do, I taught myself through coaches and mentors like Jody and others that I always leaned on, because when I mentally struggled with those things, I went and seeked out, wisdom and info from others that were better than me, help me with this. And that's what I learned how to do, which was we only have half points to work in. And I taught myself how to, if that horse was moving in the pattern, I should be able to spit out. I had one of 2 things. I either spit out a word or I spit out a number. But if I could say good or very good, I didn't have to think about it. The number came with it. It was a reversal either way. So when they're moving, and I did that in the circles a lot, and the stops and the rundowns, stops and rollbacks, because you have a run around the arena, the approach to the stop, then the stop, then the rollback. So I taught myself, I only had half points. And then we can talk about the bubble and all the rest of that, because we used to have fun playing, trying to figure some of that stuff out. But that's how I taught myself to do that.
Talk me through an actual run around the arena, stop, roll. Just talk me through practically as if you were doing it right now.
Well, if Jody said it in words, I could then put it into a decision right in real time. Because if he says, well, the horse runs in great, hits the ground, busts the stop, very good, and now starts to back up and it interrupts the cadence and has a little interruption to the flow. So all of those words all mean something. So to me, really, he's +0.5 to +1 on the approach, hits the stop, it's a +1, no problem. Now he's got a backup that's got a little bit of deviations and resistance into it. And so the point is, if I'm at a +1 and he starts backing up and there's interruptions to those things, I only have a 0.5 point and I give him a +0.5 and he's standing still in the middle. I don't have to think about it. I taught myself how to move with them. Whether I liked having to move by 0.5 point was a different conversation because that's all I had. That's it. So that's what I taught myself to do.
I appreciate that explanation because one of my next questions was actually going to be exactly that to Jody, which is, Jody, you gave us this great list in the stops and rollbacks, and I'm going to ask you for it in the circles as well here in a second of key identifiers that could be manipulative to the score. How do you weigh those things out? Because you've got 8 or 10 things that could go into one singular score. Brian just gave us an example of how he deals with it. Do you have anything for yourself that you've used over the years?
Well, I think, for prepping judges or prepping myself, the fact that we watch those runs before we actually go to work live is very, very important. And it's important from a monitor standpoint, I think, and even from committee standpoint when they're teaching judges, because there's so many variables, right? And so, like, say our maneuver evaluation DVDs, they'll show 7 different things. They'll go from -1.5 to +1.5 on an individual maneuver, and they say, okay, well, all of them have to fit in here. And I can do just like Brian just said, I've got a horse that runs in, his approach is great. He hits the ground, stops super hard, but not particularly good in front, bangs the ground pretty hard. And then he literally trots backwards on a loose rein. I mean, like if I judge the backup and I call it excellent, I'd say it's a +1.5 backup. Well, my stop, because my approach was good, he held the ground but banged it in front. Is it correct? Is it even poor? I could still end up with that maneuver being on the positive side because my backup is so good. I would like that, and I would mark that backup because that's a hard part of the maneuver. But the next guy might go, you know what, this thing banged the ground in front, and in no way in the world is that correct by my rule book definitions. So I don't care how he backed up. He's not getting any credit for this. So, and I think that when I monitored those judges, we would talk about those situations. We would see some examples of that, and I would tell them, look, I'm not going to tell you how to judge. You guys are going to judge us, but you're going to decide what you're going to do in these situations right now, before this horse show starts. Tell me what we're going to do here, because when you're going to see it, you're going to see that horse run off in his stop approach and stop big. What are you going to do with it? And you guys have to tell me, you 5 judges, tell me what you're going to do with it, and then you're going to do that the whole horse show. And let's make it even a little bit more complicated. That's in the Futurity pen with those 400 great horses. Then we go over to the Adequan pen where we've got these old guys that have been showing all year long with limited riders, and I'm going to say, you know what? Help them if you can. So, there's variables like crazy.
Which is being lenient, and I love every part of that. Way love it. Which is being lenient on helping them. When he says helping them, that's about allowing them to be a little bit more forgiving. It's allowing them to make some more mistakes, if you want to call it that. When you're going into the Futurity finals, is a different, so that standard's got to tighten up in the way you go. I love every part of that, and that's where it's interesting, because with the maneuver that Jody just described, including the backup, because all of those things go in it, and there is no black and white. I would tell you that's exactly why we use multiple judge systems. and why you have me and Jody and 3 other guys or 10 more guys or girls. It's not just him. Why do we use multiple judge systems? Why is a 5-judge system more powerful and effective than a 3-judge system and a 2-judge system? Because there's no hiding in rating, and now you have all of those variables being dealt with, and now it comes to the system, and how do you put all of that together? I would go back to, because that's a great one that Jody said, because a phenomenal description of it. Now comes, give me 5 judges and their 5 unique different scores. And I would then tell you that their 5 scores are more accurate than any 3 in there. Just me. And Jody and I will beat that one up all the time. But I say that with the limitation of take me to the best of the competition, and that would be true. Do we want to do that as we go down in the competition and be more lenient? Then the answer is no. And so, but that's also why both you're at 2 and 3 judges. On a 2-judge system, should they both be sitting on the left wall? I'd say no, put one on the left wall and one on the right wall. And will they be the same score? No, but you don't want them to be the same score. But now when you put those 2 in, because again, you're getting a better representation. When you put them in for one score, that score is your final and official. So I love it. He couldn't have done it better. Thanks,
and just to clarify, when you talked about going down in levels, you said, should we be more lenient? No. You actually mean, should we be more lenient? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we should be more lenient, which means the standard opens up.
Right.
You allow a little bit more. That's correct.
Which is true in every other sport. I mean,
Yes.
the complexity of scoring a goal when you're a peewee soccer player is different than...
Well, they change the goal height, and they change the 2-point and the 3-point line, and they do all those things, yes.
Let's talk about, actually, before we move on to circles, in the level 4 NRHA finals, we had 2 runs that I want to just pose back to you guys that had 1-point differentials on the stop and back, the very first maneuver of the pattern. Sean Flaherty's winning run on DMO and Matt Mills' run, which I think was the last horse of the go. Both of them had it in their stop and back, and I'll give you the differentials. Matt had scores from a 0 to a +1. Sean had scores from a +0.5 to a +1.5. Looking at those scorecards, can you guys tell me what might have happened there? How, why we're seeing such a variance?
Sure. I think Jody's got a better answer than mine. Why is the depth of competition? That's number one. Because you're now talking about how good stuff is. And then why are you seeing a 1-point differential on how good stuff is? Because you have all of the complexities that Jody just made reference to. I think part of the rest of it is how do we start to narrow that in and make it a little bit more defined. I don't fully have that answer, but I think working as a team, coach, monitor, how they're led, how they're trained, education. Jody talks a lot about education, which you can never be educated too much. So anyways, Jody, you got...
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree totally. I think, we obviously say maybe Matt's run, somebody maybe didn't back up as good, and somebody let that part of that maneuver weigh very, very heavily on their decision, and someone didn't. And I can live with 0 to +1. I can't, like we've talked about in the past. I have a very difficult time with someone telling me it was poor and someone telling me it was good. I mean, when we have that 5-judge system, somebody's going to let that backup weigh on them. Someone is not. Someone's still going to give him credit for the approach, the stop. And maybe they said, you know what, that's a +1 approach and stop and a 0 backup. And, someone said, no, it's a -0.5 backup and it's a +0.5, stop and approach. So there are different ways to get to that. Like I said, and it's a 5-judge system, it's like Brian just said, so you don't expect everybody to see exactly the same thing. We just want them to be as close as they possibly can. And I think from an educational standpoint, if your monitor or your coaches at your schools cover that, I think that judges look for that. I mean, judges want that. They look for someone to say, here's what you want to do. And I think that monitor's job is not to tell them what to do, but it's to make sure that everybody gets on the same page and they focus the same thing on that same maneuver. And you don't have to be identical about it, but like, say, if we had the opportunity to show Matt's run in and stop to a group of judges that were getting ready to judge, pattern 9 or 10 in the futurity finals, and that room full of judges, before that show even started, you looked at that maneuver and you told those 5 guys, okay, look, watch this stop and back up. What do you think it is? Well, 2 guys said, well, it's +1. One guy said, no, hell, it's a 0. Come on. Let's get closer than that. There's 2 boxes here. Why? Okay, maybe you're weighing a little bit too much on this, or maybe you're giving too much credit here. I mean, there's ways to get that closer, but there's the reason that there are differences of opinions in those circles and those stop and backups or stop and rollbacks is because of the multiple components and the weight each individual judge gives that part of the maneuver.
That's good. And Brian, you mentioned a few minutes ago that the rollbacks are probably the most diverse in style right now to what we're seeing in the industry. I think what you're talking about, Jody, is so important, and it's easy for us to use phrases like we need more education. The practicality of that is very challenging, right? Because how do you disseminate information not only to those making the decisions like the judges, but how do you disseminate that information to the general membership and the exhibitor pool consistently over time? That's a challenge we all as an industry have to continue to face. Because to what you're saying, Jody, judges want clear direction on what to do with those things. I'd say so do exhibitors. Exhibitors want to know, how important the backup is in that maneuver. I've so many times heard people, I love being an announcer. You just hear the back gate chatter. You get somebody who walks away from watching a really fancy stop with a really poor backup or a really poor rollback, and they're like, they didn't give them credit for that fancy stop because you forgot to take into account the rollback, right? But back to education, right? And we have a hard time, I think, sharing what that standard is and how to do that to our exhibitors as much as we do to our officials as well. Thinking back to style and how diverse that is in the rollbacks, as an industry, how do we deal with style? And I'll pick on Sean a little bit. I love Sean. I have so much respect for him as a horseman, but he has a very unique style to his rollbacks. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. His sometimes look very different, for example, than Andrea's. But Sean can get it done correctly. Sean cannot.
Well, I'd give you all, if you took the top 3 to 5 horses at the fraternity finals, Sean, Casey Deary, Abby Lingle, Andrea, Matt, take that group. They all have their own style and exhibition of it. But when we talk about the rollback, so it's very interesting when you look at that level and the fine distinctions. And before we go too far, because I want to just give you the system. Because if we go back to Matt Mills and Sean's stop and back up and the 1-point differential, if you looked at all 5 scores at the maneuver value level, Sean's would have been a +1 mathematically. Add them all up, divide by 5, you get a +1.
Divide by 5. Keep
yes,
all 5 scores.
Because I'm just using simple math.
Okay.
And Matt's would have been a +0.5. So whether it was a good and a very good or a very good and an excellent, you can beat it up all day long. But, Sean's stop and back up was just that little bit better than Matt's. And we could probably go find it if we had the run. But by the officiating system and the scores, and I'm using all 5 because I'm not dropping high and low. Mm-hmm. So, again, just for simplified functions, that begins to give you that, which is what Jody talked about with Casey, the difference between Casey Deary and marking a 228.5 being second, reserve champion in futurity, and Sean marking a 230 being champion in futurity, is one maneuver by half a point with 3 judges. That's very fine distinction. All of that goes into when you then talk about style. So I'll let Jody kind of elaborate on that, but in our entire lifetime, reining is not a style game, it's a control game. This is about dictating to your horse completely with little or no apparent resistance, and the best reined horse will be willingly guided. So that's what this game is, and now the exhibitor gets to exhibit that control their way. And if you looked at those top 5 horses, no 2 of them were the same. They quite unique. If you blacked out the rider, about everybody could say, well, Andrea's riding that one, Sean's riding that one, and Abby's riding that one, and even Casey, because Deary's got a very freer, flower. I don't know how to put it in words. It's his style, but you see it.
Chelsea, I think you used Sean as an example, and we've seen him show for so many years, and good as it gets, right? And you hear people complain about Sean. He'll maybe do that. His horse will swap ends, and then he'll get out of that hole in a heartbeat. I mean, he didn't waste any time, but maybe not a pure rollback. But Sean is so good; he gets the best out of his horse. And, you see Sean on a horse that can roll back, they'll roll back with BH's best. I mean, those things will come back over a hawk, and you have one that maybe can't do that, Sean will get him around and get going the other direction as fast as that horse is capable of, which maybe is part of that little in-swap thing that he does. So it's up to you as a judge. And like I said, the miserable thing about the half-point increments is that Sean can have that great rundown and stop and have that little in-swap and get out of that hole like crazy. And maybe it's a little better than a plus half, but it sure as heck isn't a 1, because his next horse is going to come in and roll back and do that plus 1. So you can't put them in the same box, but maybe they're closer than a half point. So, it's part of marking and reining.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I appreciate these kind of conversations, because for me, this is education that hearing you guys talk through something like that is for you as a judge so instinctual. Those are thoughts that you have every single time you sit in the chair. For me, not being a judge, hearing you talk about that clarifies what I'm seeing. Sean just won the futurity with such a nice run. He got those rollbacks done. But it would be easy for me, not being a judge, to then assume, oh man, Sean's rollback must be what I'm trying to go for.
No, but I'd even take the last 2 futurity champions, go back 1 year, 1030, Casey Deary, last year, wins it. Okay, good, great. But if you just looked at that, and the style was quite unique and different than Sean and Addie Amore this year. So that's the beauty of the sport, in my opinion, because it allows for all of that. Period. 1030 is one of those horses to me that's it's like one of those special ones and they're rare when they come along, but they just, for whatever reason, I can go back. It wasn't a futurity horse, but Boomernick would be one of those. Topsail Cody when we were kids. And so there's just some of those that, for whatever that reason, especially when you look at futurity horses, 1030 to me did that to me as an individual. Not that Addie Moore is not a nice horse and a mare on top of it, way cool. That's like Snow Gun, way cool. But they're unique to themselves. And so it's not about that's the mold that I got to be in. It's the quality of the control that you got to be in. How's that?
That's
it's as good as I can say it.
That's wonderful, I think. Shall we talk about circles? Jody, can you take us through the complexity that comes into circles and coming up with a maneuver score for circles? Why we are seeing such differentials on our circles?
I think sometimes that people don't give their judges enough credit when they are evaluating circles. But again, that we had multiple reasons why that stop and back up or stop and roll back can change, and I think we have to add even more when we talk about marking a set of circles. I mean, first we have a canter departure, right? That's an important part of it. We have a downward transition. We have our location, pattern placement, quality of movement. How good is this horse lope? I mean, is he a good, we've seen some horses that can run large fast and they're terrible, nearly breaking gait when they lope slow smalls. Our lead change, is it good? Does it squirt? Penalty application, is it early? Is it a little bit late, but not enough for a penalty? Another very, very important part for me is that horse's tail. I mean, if I see one that's so dead that it's bouncing off their hocks, I have to take something away because of that. Is that horse between the bridle reins when he's circling? Is he leaning on it? Degree of difficulty, how hard is he running those circles? All those components come into maneuver evaluation in half-point increments. And if any one of those things goes haywire, my downward transition, takes a quarter of a circle, but the rest of the stuff is excellent. How much does that weigh on that overall maneuver? I only have a half a point. So, if that horse was running a +1 set of circles and then all of a sudden my slow small is a 0, or where do I go with that? Do I go to a +half? Do I still give him credit, or can I still give him a 1 because that was the only part of it? And we can go to lead change. We can go, like I said, to a bad tail. We can go to bad mover. So many components to that circle. They can be very hard to judge. And like I said, your father right there can sit and look at something and something will weigh a half point heavier on it than me, or vice versa. And we'll be a half point apart. We won't be a point apart, but we'll be a half point apart, and it's supposed to be.
And yes, I want to spend a second talking about, because when you talk about balance, quality of motion, and then you put the tails, because I get stuck with a bad tail. Aren't they all bad tails? So because
you mean a bad dead tail?
Well, that in itself is, I think, an oxymoron. So yes, that's what I mean.
Synonym.
Why are we doing tails? I'm not sure. I know the conversation and why we try to convince ourselves.
Well, let me point the question at you. What's the role of, how does tail function, the use of a tail or the lack of use of a tail in circles, affect the way you as a judge scores it?
Again, I don't know. You'd have to go out into the industry and ask them all how Brian was as a judge, and they can all have their opinion and blah, blah, blah.
Tell me what you did with it.
What I used to be critical about it, because it makes no sense to me. The tail function to a horse is the other end of the balance beam, which is just like his head and neck. And so as a horseman, your ability to look inside, watch balance of a horse, motion, form to function and motion, and that's why I always say there is no hiding. So I know why we started to play with their tails, but the answer is, when you take a horse's tail function away, you are changing their balance. So then the horse has to compensate and figure that out in a different form. Tail function is actually normal in a horse. It's excessive function that displays a bad attitude. Well, a pissed off horse, I can see whether he moves his tail or not. So, I don't need you to not show me his tail on if he's pissed off. So, which is also different than a horse that's under a lot of control. And so an intimidated horse and a mad horse, we can see all these things. And I've found that whole thing to be continually fascinating. So, but horses that don't have tail functions and they go out there and step on the gas pedal and then slow down and they're stuck between their hocks all the time is not normal. And so all of that's got stuff you got to deal with. And so do you have to be analyzing all of that. Yes, and the circles in particular has got, when Jody was talking about the variables of the rollbacks.
All right, Brian, I hear you on everything you're saying, but can you get a little bit more tactical and tangible? When you see a horse with a dead tail, what do you do with it?
I'd reduce the maneuver by half point.
Every maneuver?
Yes. If the tail function is interrupted enough to, then the answer would be yes, because I only have half points. That's what I taught myself to do. You can have your opinion about it, but that's when they paid me and put me in those spots. That's the way I did it, because bad tail jobs certainly affected it. It violates A general. It's not pleasing to watch. It's not normal. So those are true. So every time that horse is loping and moving and you're stepping on the gas and stepping on the brakes and all of those things, that's what I did. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but I had to learn how to be distinctive accordingly. So, yes, goes into it. There's no and ifs or buts about it. What do you do with it as an official, and what do you do with it and be consistent with it? That's hard, and the sport keeps trying to evolve and get better. But it's a fascinating, and I get very confused with that one. And the same would be true with motion, because when you frame a horse up in 4 beaters, I'm going to give you the same one, because not only bad tails or horses that don't have tail functions, but teaching these horses how to 4-beat in a 3-beated lope, whoa. And, well, there's no part of that that's good. So what I have to do, teach myself how to deal with it and evaluate it. Well, a 4-beated lope is a bad lope. Well, I only have half points. Away you go. And I can give you plenty of those. I used to always be low. You used to always toss me out, because I would be more critical on those than not. You know, whether 2 strides or 6 strides or the whole circle, those are degrees by which. But you give me a 4-beated lope in a small, slow circle for the whole circle, I'm going to go -1 on that particular. Now, I did that against, so if you had a +1/2 and a -1, I'm at a -1/2, and now you got one more circle to go. That's what I taught myself to do. I'm just using that in the circles, but 4-beated lopes, absolutely. It goes in that similar category. It's another form of bad maneuver.
Jody, can you talk us through how you handle tails in those
Sure.
maneuvers?
I mean, and if it's a bad tail, and don't get me wrong, I mean, if you've got one that's wringing its tail and it's so unhappy it's trying to take your hat off, that's not pleasing to watch either. So, and that will weigh the same to me as a dead tail. And you have to be careful, but it also helps to be a horseman, because I've had some great tailed horses. Quiet tails are desirable because it shows a happy horse. And I've had some horses that, you'd have to knock a hole in before they'd even lift it, because they're happy horses and they're comfortable carrying it that way. That's a natural horse, but you can tell that it's a natural tail. And people, they block tails as like I said, from a financial equalizer. I've seen some mares that produce quiet-tailed horses. They do that. I mean, all their foals are great. And if I owned her foal should be worth $50,000 more than somebody else that goes and knocks a tail down or cuts it, because they want theirs to look exactly like mine. But you know what? Mine's natural. Yours isn't. So there's I put forth the weighted tail, because to me that was so much kinder than somebody that's knocking a tail down. At least that thing can get relief after he's been in the pen for 2.5 or 3 or 5 minutes or whatever the case may be. Pleasure horses are using it. I mean, it's the lesser of the two evils, right? So anyway, I'm not. I mean, I would take it a half point in the circles. That's where it bothered me the most. Horses making stop approach or spinning. I mean, if it affected the quality of the maneuver because they're dead-tailed, obviously that's going to happen. But I mean, I didn't look to go take it on like a stop approach, but circling for sure. And if it takes, if it costs you a point on my card, that can be very, very expensive. I mean, for you. So it just, and I know some guys that will pay absolutely no attention to it, and some that will.
One of my last questions for you guys, as it comes to maneuver spreads in the circles, and of course you can elaborate because if this affects other maneuvers, please do explain, is quality of motion. How much of a weight does that play into your overall maneuver score when you have so much else going on, pattern placement, correctness, all of those things? As a judge, how does quality of motion impact your score?
I think it plays into it a lot, and I don't think it's hard because the minute the horse moves, you talk about quality of motion, you have the walk and the lope, and then the gallop. So, I mean, can we see all of that? Yes. Does the official have to be, one, aware, and two, making a decision on it? Yes. And the quality continues to go up, which leads to why I've been a proponent more so recently on technical specificity, because that's exactly an example of it. Quality of motion in a horse, a good mover, a bad mover, an average mover, a sloppy hocked, a quick kneed, long pastern, all those things go into that, but you can see them, and you don't have to say the whys and the what fors, but you can see them. A well-balanced, good moving horse should be attractive to you, and it brings you to it. And that in itself is telling you something, which is part of credit earning. So yes, go there and don't just sit on zero and call it correct all day. And so yes, the 4-beat versus 3-beat, and I'm a stickler about that. Jody can tell you. So I am a stickler. It's flat out irritating because it violates the rule book. It violates the fundamental correctness of what a lope and or gallop is. And why we, one, teach our horses to do that, and then two, continue to show it. But some group of people think that it's cool, that they can go from fast to 4-beat and slow, and I think it's like makes me want to barf.
Jody, quality of motion. Give me your take.
I mean, and it works on both ends. We've seen, and not so much anymore because these pedigrees on these things they're breeding away from that now. But we used to see some of those little rough galloping little short horses that look like they're just beating you to death in fast circles, and it's not pleasing to watch. They might be steering really good, but if they're bad lopers, out of balance we call it, but I'm just saying a bad mover, a rough galloper. It's like, you're doing your job, but I'm gonna call you correct. You went fast and slow, but you're not pleasing to watch. I can't call you poor, but I'm gonna give you as much as I can. And some of those horses that can't lope those slow small circles, they aren't just taught to do that. There's some pedigrees that just say I can't go slow without looking like I'm trotting behind. And if I have to guess whether or not you're loping, you are in the extremely poor category. I don't care what you did. I mean, I ain't going there. So,
and that's the spot that I think that we've got to compel ourselves to continue to be at. What Jody's verbally illustrating, and he's right. Those are the weaker hocked horses that are by pedigree weaker hocked. Whether they're weaker stifled, longer in that limb or not, but it's not the why, it's what is. And so, yes, we can see it. And yes, we've got to be, as officials, compelled to be more accurate with the assessment.
Great.
Which is why that's why circles and rollbacks continue to be struggling maneuvers for all the reasons that Jody just elaborated on.
Including quality of motion.
Yes.
Because you can have, I think we actually see it a lot. Here would be my assessment. You guys correct me if I'm wrong. As our competition evolves and as we go up in leveling, as we go to our level 4 open guys, and I don't just mean at the Futurity, Run for a Million, any of those types of events, the shootout, the Run for a Million shootout, the Cactus Classic qualifier. To me, we actually see horses who are doing a really good job of getting the maneuvers correct, but can be poor movers. And it almost feels like we're seeing more poor movers at the top. And I don't mean that as a statistical ratio, but it happens. I always have a hard time, and I'm not a judge, and that's probably why I have a hard time, but I have a hard time when I see a really cool maneuver that's being exhibited. You know, they're getting it done with the horse that they have, but they are a bad mover. They are a poor mover. And so I just find that interesting.
And they're fundamentally correct, because they aren't earning credit because they don't have smoothness, finesse, while they have control, but you don't have the credit earnings. So there's the answer to your equation. And that's where the exhibitors and the fans get confused, because they saw the same thing you saw and they didn't see a credit earning score. Well, the rest of the equation is, the rest of the story, it didn't have the rest of it, and some of it's God made. So then I would say, good sportsmanship. Stay with what you got. That's, you know, Jody talks about the horse is the leveling function. It's about horsepower. So, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there any other graphs or data points that you guys want to hit on before we wrap this up? Because we only showed that one graph, but I want to make sure I didn't miss anything.
No,
I think
that's the one that represents it well, because it breaks it out in the maneuver groups accordingly.
Okay.
And that's just the Open Futurity. We could challenge ourselves if you want to look forward or backwards. I could do that in 2022 if we wanted to look across the age events, but
not having the data to go along with it, but you guys having been in the industry for so long, have circles and rollbacks always been a big struggle? Have we always seen judges have a differential on those maneuvers, or is that new for us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's anything new. I think that the quality is not as good as it was today, but at the time, the differences were still there, right? I mean, you know, you might have the Futurity finals 20 years ago can't warm these guys up now, but they still had that. They still rolled back the same, and they still circled the same. So yeah, it's always been there.
Yeah, I probably agree. We figured it out in some other spots. Spins just happened to be my reflex, because we see more powerful, dynamic spinning horses today than ever before. But part of that is because the officiating figured out how to not be too critical, allow them to do it, but then be more clear on the penalties because the overspin, underspin. I think Jody's 100% correct on that. We've always struggled with the circles and the rollbacks because they are more complex, takes more time to fulfill those maneuvers, and there's more that goes into them. So, yes, we've always kind of struggled.
Well, I'm certainly excited to see what the next year of horses are going to bring us. That concludes my set of questions for today. I know we've got some other great episodes coming in the coming weeks, so I'll be super excited to hear what you guys talk about. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being here again, and we so appreciate, especially when we spend the time on the reining side and the officiating specifics, because you ask us those valuable questions, and it makes Jody and I have to be more point blank and truthful about it. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. So until next time, enjoy the ride.
Hey, Chelsea, Brian, thank you so much. And, you know, anytime we get talking about the officiating, it's a passion for us, Chelsea. You know that, right? So sometimes we may get a little carried away, but you know what? It's something that, you know what? We can make a difference. So I'll thank you all for watching. And, you know, just like I would tell my non-pros, you know, stay in the middle.
Today's episode is brought to you by 4D Productions in cooperation with the Consultment Agency, a full-service agency that helps bring forward-thinking equine brands into the 21st century using digital skills and services such as website development, graphic design, social media, and media production such as the podcast you're consuming here today. Thank you so much for riding along with us today. Sign up at cowboyoffice.com to be the first to know about topics affecting the industry we love so much. You can reach out to us with topics you care about by finding us on TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and all podcast platforms. And remember, share this episode with someone that may enjoy it, because the more we can share our horses with others, the better our world will be.